they were handed something most people spend an entire lifetime chasing. Free houses in a wealthy country, steady jobs with real wages, schools for their children, hospitals down the road, the comfort and safety of one of the richest nations on earth. All they had to do was stay, and they said no. Every rational argument sat on the side of staying. Opportunity, security, an easier life by almost any measure you could name. And yet, very nearly to the last soul, they chose instead to cross the loneliest ocean on the planet and sail back to a tiny volcanic island that had, barely 2 years before, split open and tried to bury their village under molten rock. What you're about to hear is the one time an entire people were offered the modern dream, examined it closely and quietly handed it straight back. It began on an ordinary morning in October 1961. There had been small tremors for days, the kind a community living on a volcano learns not to panic about. Then the ground just behind the settlement tore open. A mound of rock and ash began to swell where flat farmland had been the day before, and a dull red heat started to glow at its base. There was no fire brigade to call, no road to escape down, no plane waiting on a runway, because there was no runway. There was only the sea. So the whole population grabbed what they could carry, and in their open longboats, the same flat boats they used to chase lobster out through the breaking surf, they pulled away from the only home any of them had ever known, watching their island smoke behind them on the water. They sheltered on a neighbouring island first. Then a passing Dutch ship carried them north to Cape Town, and from there a liner took them on, week after week across open ocean, all the way to England. Try to picture it from inside their eyes. A great many of them had never seen a city in their lives. Among the oldest were people who had reached the end of their years without ever laying eyes on a motor car, without ever waiting in a queue for anything, without once sliding coins across a shop counter, without a single evening in front of a television set or one nervous step across a busy road. They came from a place of a single village and almost no crime, where every face in sight belonged to a relative and the doors stayed unlocked through the night. And now they were set down in 1960s Britain, housed in a former airfield camp at Calshot on the Hampshire coast, surrounded by a nation of 50 million strangers who had never heard their names and had no reason to learn them. They were given work, they were given wages. For a short while they were even famous, a curiosity in the newspapers, the islanders from the far end of the world. And almost from the beginning, something was quietly going wrong. Here is the part of the story that rarely gets told, and it may be the part that matters most. The islanders had spent generation after generation in near total isolation, which meant their bodies had simply never met the everyday illnesses of a crowded modern country. The ordinary infections a British child shrugs off in a week, the coughs and colds and winter flus that drift through any busy town, reached the Tristanians with almost no built-up defences to meet them. People who had been strong and healthy on the island began falling sick in England. Some of the older islanders, the very ones who carried the community's memory and its language, died of common infections their new neighbours barely registered catching. The wider world had promised them safety, and instead the wider world was quietly making them ill. For a people who measured their wealth by who were still gathered around the table, every single loss landed like a catastrophe. And underneath the illness ran something quieter, and just as corrosive: homesickness. They missed the silence of a place with no engines, the sight of the ocean filling every horizon, a night sky thick with more stars than any English town would ever show them. They had crossed the world to safety, and what they felt there, more than anything, was the ache of being far from home. And even for those who stayed healthy, the bargain was not what it had looked like on paper. Yes, there was money now, but there were also endless new things to spend it on that they had never once needed, and bills that arrived and never stopped. Yes, there was opportunity, but there was also theft and bolted doors and the peculiar loneliness of moving through thousands of people while belonging to none of them. On the island, each of them had been someone to everyone. In England, they were no one to almost anyone. The noise never let up. The pace never eased. They had been given more of nearly everything, and somehow what they felt deep down was less. Meanwhile, far to the south, the volcano had fallen silent. In 1962, a small scientific expedition sailed back to find out what remained, fully braced to discover the village entombed under lava. It wasn't. The flow had crept its slow way toward the settlement, and then, almost unbelievably, halted, devouring the lobster factory and a stretch of the shoreline, but leaving the houses, the little church, and the farmed land standing. The island was still there. It was, against every expectation, still home. And news of that travelled fast through the camp at Calshot. The door everyone had assumed was sealed forever had somehow swung back open. So the islanders were offered something that almost no people in recorded history have ever been handed. A real, deliberate choice between two entire lives. Stay in England, with all of its comfort and its prospects and its safety, or sail back to a remote volcano in the middle of nowhere, with no guarantees of anything, and rebuild whatever the eruption had wrecked. They didn't leave it to their leaders, and they didn't leave it to chance. They held a vote, and when the papers were counted, the outcome wasn't close. It was overwhelming. The people of Tristan chose, almost without dissent, to turn their backs on the rich world and go home. Sit with how rare that is. We are told again and again that every person given the option moves toward more money, more choice, more security. Here was a whole nation that looked at precisely that offer and deliberately walked the other way. A small advance party went first, back across the same endless water, to test whether a life could really be restarted out there. Then the rest of them followed. They came back to a village that was battered but still standing, to fields that needed clearing and a harbour that needed rebuilding, and a future that came attached to no promises whatsoever. It was harder than England. It would always be harder than England, and that, it turned out, had never been the point. They cleared the cooled lava by hand. They rebuilt what the sea and the eruption had taken, and they stitched the community back together, name by name, around the same handful of families it had always been. We tend to assume a good life is something you accumulate, that you score it by what you manage to gain. The people of Tristan scored it instead by what they refused to lose. They did not choose the island because it was easy. It was, by a wide margin, the hardest option in front of them. They chose it because it was theirs, because it knew them, and because a comfortable life among strangers had shown them, with painful clarity, exactly what a hard life among their own people was worth. The modern world made them its very best offer. They listened to all of it, and then they sailed home. So here is the question worth sitting with tonight. If someone slid that same ballot across the table to you, a safe, comfortable, prosperous life, in exchange for never going home again, how certain are you really that you'd mark it the way the world assumes everyone would? Tell me below and be honest about it. And if this one stayed with you, pass it along to someone who has spent a long time quietly wondering whether the place they came from is still the place they belong.